In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace a carrier bearing. Drive shaft support bearing, a center support bearing, a hanger bearing, collar bearing. There's a bunch of names for this bearing, but whatever you want to call it, it keeps your drive shaft from bouncing up and down and making horrible noises. So it's a kind of an important part. Now, if you're a supporter of Christian cars, you know I've been working on this C20 pickup here. Just got done giving it a sweet garage paint job. Need to do a little wet sanding and then it'll be done. But I was cruising it around and I noticed this like terrible clunking sound, and then above like 15 to 20 miles an hour there's a horrible vibration. So I went underneath the car and noticed this carrier bearing just torn to shreds and not even doing anything. So in this video I'm going to show you how to take your carrier bearing from looking like this into this. It's a super simple process. It costs very little amount of money, just takes a little bit of time. I did the whole thing in about 3 hours. Yeah, enough talk, let's jump right into it and fix our carrier bearings.
Alright, you know how we do things. Hit your parking brake first, throw some wheel chocks in front and behind your front tires because we're jacking up the back of the car here. And then throw some jack stands underneath and we're ready to start disassembling. First thing we're doing is detaching the drive shaft from the rear differential. Mine is attached by some U-bolts holding onto a universal joint. The U-joint can get stuck onto the rear differential, so don't be scared to hit it with a hammer to break it free. Then go up to the center of the drive shaft and detach the busted up carrier bearing. If your carrier bearing is still somewhat functional and holding the drive shaft in place, detach that first, then go to the rear differential. Once the drive shaft is all free, pull it out about 1 foot forward, sliding the yoke out of the transmission. I did a drip pan where the drive shaft yoke slips into the transmission. If you're working in a driveway like I am and you don't want oil drips all over, let your drive shaft and transmission drip into the fluid collector for a couple seconds, then pull the drive shaft all the way out and then bring it over to your workspace. Now that the drive shaft is out, take a look at the state of this bearing. Terrible. This is what it should look like. So obviously this needs to be replaced. Before we start tearing into this too much, there's a couple prep things we need to do. We will start pounding on this drive shaft pretty hard with a hammer. So to make sure we're not losing any U-joint caps, we're gonna tape them up. And then also we wanna mark the drive shaft in the center here. This way you know that the orientation of the rear drive shaft is going back the way it came out. Mine has a couple arrows already grooved into the drive shaft, so I'm good to go. Let's start tearing this apart now. Pop the snap rings out of both sides of the U-joint and put them somewhere safe because we're going to be reusing them later. Then grab a 3/4 inch socket or just a socket smaller than the top U-joint opening. Then position the drive shaft so that the cross or the spider has room to push that lower cap through the bottom facing U-joint opening. Grab your socket and then start tapping the top U-joint cap and you'll see it start to slide down. The bottom cap is going to start popping out of the bottom, in which you can flip the shaft over and then actually pull that cap out, which will give you a little bit of wiggle room to separate the whole U-joint assembly, separating the front and back drive shaft. Then make sure that the cap is looking good and greased and no little bearing rods are missing. You can put it back on, tape it up, and make sure the cap doesn't fall off. The last little bit is to pull the yoke off the front drive shaft, but before we start doing that, we're going to put a mark lining up the yoke to the drive shaft. It can only go on one way because the splines of the drive shaft act like a key, so the yoke will only slide on one way. But to make life a little bit easier, I like to put a mark on this and save some time. Take the bolt holding the yoke off. For me, that's a 3/4 inch socket. Get that bolt all the way out and then pull the yoke off. Then remove what's left of your bearing. You could try to get this off with a hammer and vise. If that doesn't work, the flathead method might. Or if you're done messing around, throw that 3/4 inch bolt back into the shaft and grab some jaw pullers and pull this thing out. Now it's time to put it all back together, and in my opinion, the easier part. Start off by sliding the new carrier bearing on the shaft. Then you'll line up the yoke with your marks you just made, which then lines up the spline grooves. Tighten the bolt, and as you're tightening, you'll see the yoke push down the bearing, putting the bearing in place, and then tighten that bolt up as much as you can get it. Now it's time to attach up both the drive shafts. So start off by lining up the marks you made on the shafts to make sure that the proper ends are connected. Then pull the tape off the U-joint cross and then pull one of the bearing caps off. Then slide the uncapped portion of the cross into the yoke of the U-joint. Then line up the side that is still capped into the U-joint hole. Center that uncapped rod in the U-joint hole, then put the cap back on it and then tap it into place. Next, grab a smaller socket than the U-joint opening and pound the cap all the way down until the channels for the snap ring clips are exposed. Then clean out that snap ring clip channel and then put the snap ring back in. Then the last step is to flip over the U-joint and then repeat the process with the socket, cleaning the snap ring channel and putting in the clip. Once the whole U-joint assembly is put back together and the clips are seated in there nicely, grab your whole drive shaft and your new carrier bearing assembly and pull it over to the truck. Back underneath the truck, try not to drag the shaft around too much. I still have mine rolling around on this little creeper to make life easy. Start by working the drive shaft through any holes in the frame. You're going to start from the rear of the vehicle and then end up at the transmission. Then slide the slip yoke into the transmission, and while you're sliding that slip into the transmission, you're going to try and guide the carrier bearing to the place it needs to sit. Now that everything is roughly in place, go to the rear diff and then clean up the flange yoke. I added a little bearing grease on it to prevent any seizing in the future. Now push that bearing into the flange yoke. And then the last step is to push the U-bolts in, throw their nuts on, and tighten them up. Then go back up to the center of the drive shaft and you're gonna tighten down that carrier bearing, and then we're all done. Lower the truck down and take it cruising.
All right, everybody, that was the whole video. I hope it helped you out. If you want to see some more restoration on the C20 pickup, don't forget to check out my channel. Thanks for watching.